What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds good to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If you're someone who does not fancy the combination, then I've got some links down in the description for you, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Ooh, woo. Y'all ready to be pissed off? I hope so, because there ain't a snowball's chance in hell's hottest little corner that you're going to be leaving this video today with anything other than just a blinding white hot rage. Actually, you know what? Let me pedal that back a little because it does get pretty heartwarming and inspiring towards the end of the story. So I might be able to turn things around for you by the time you're done, but just know that middle part, ooh, you gonna be mad. Remember Janice Trahan's story? The woman whose crazy-ass ex injected her with AIDS as a way to ruin her after their breakup? Yeah, this story is very similar to that one. Only worse. Honestly, I hate to say that because both stories are awful. Actually, all the stories we talk about here are awful. Why do you keep coming back here? I'm kidding. Please don't leave me. I'm sorry. What I'm getting at is that today's case and the circumstances surrounding it and everything that actually happened, diabolical. But like I said, it does get pretty inspiring towards the end. So yeah, it's going to be rough for a while, but I urge you to try to stick around and to try to ride it out with me. Okay? All right, so today's story begins in Troy, Missouri, with the chance encounter of two young 20-somethings. Troy is a fairly small city located in eastern Missouri, about an hour and a half outside of the Missouri-Illinois border. Overall, Troy is known for its historic Main Street district, its unique shopping opportunities, and its parks. However, as previously mentioned in this story, it serves as a backdrop for a budding relationship between a woman named Jennifer Jackson and a man named Brryan Stewart. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of background information to give you as far as Jennifer is concerned, but I sure can tell you a boatload of crap about Brryan. Brryan Thomas Stewart was born in Alton, Illinois on October 30th, 1966, and he grew up in a military household, meaning that for a decent chunk of his adolescence, his family was forced to move around just in order to keep up with his father's army assignments. And actually, growing up, watching his father serve his country and support his family in doing so, Brryan in turn quickly developed his own personal interest in joining the military once he had finished school. However, after graduating out in high school in the mid-80s, before enlisting in the Navy, Brryan first attended St. Louis Community College, where he obtained a phlebotomy certificate. Then he parlayed that certificate into some sort of medical position within the Navy. And actually, it was during training for this position that Brryan was relocated to Missouri, where he ultimately came across Jennifer Jackson. Jennifer has since stated in interviews that as soon as she laid eyes on Brryan, she was hooked. He was handsome, he was charismatic, he was charming. I mean, we've all heard the corny ass women love a man in uniform thing, and that's coming from the woman who married a man in uniform. But yeah, Brryan was clean cut, he was well dressed, he was clearly driven and ambitious, he had a good job. Oh, and he had a butt chin.
He has one of these.
A face ass?
A chin dimple.
Yeah, he had a chin dimple, and when Jennifer saw it, she was like, that's hot as shit, sign me the fuck up. To which Brryan was like, here's a pen. I'm sorry. That was my really awful way of trying to convey to you that Brryan, upon introduction, was also pretty into Jennifer. The two quickly began dating, they frequently talked about getting married, they moved in together, and then before either one of them knew what hit them, Jennifer turned up pregnant. And this wasn't Jennifer's first rodeo with pregnancy and babies. She actually had a child from a previous relationship. However, it was Brryan's, and to say that he didn't handle it well, yikes. Once the honeymoon phase of their relationship wore off and things started to get more serious, Brryan, in turn, got much more comfortable letting his true colors show. You know, just letting his freak flag fly. Now, sadly, Jennifer herself has admitted later in interviews that she didn't have the best intuition when it came to picking men. I still don't think that anything she had been through previously could have possibly prepared her for the roller coaster she was about to experience dating and living with Brryan. His moods were so hot and cold, and his temper was so unpredictable and so volatile that Jennifer just never knew what to expect with him. It was like dating Jekyll and Hyde. Sure, he had a sweet, romantic, and tender side, but he also had a mean, terrifying, and abusive side. During arguments, Jennifer has claimed that Brryan would hit her, he would kick her, spit on her, he would bite her. And what's really unfortunate is that this behavior did not improve even slightly with the announcement of Jennifer's pregnancy. If anything, once he found out that they were expecting, Brryan just amped up the crazy. One day, he'd be giving her a beautiful framed poem as a gift, only to go on to sexually assault her a different day. Yes, one day during Jennifer's pregnancy, Brryan propositioned her for sex, which she declined. I can't imagine why. But not surprisingly, this display of disobedience, it absolutely enraged Brryan. He rushed at Jennifer, he grabbed her, and he pinned her down before forcing his entire fist into her body and telling her that essentially she would be smart to do as he said and to try to keep him around because given the trauma he had just subjected her to, likely no man would ever want her again. He told her she was ruined. And look, I typically don't condone violence, but just this part of the story alone makes me want to punch this man right in the chin dimple. And we're not even to the worst parts of the story yet. Anyway, after weeks of walking on eggshells and never knowing what on any given day might set Brryan off, I have to imagine that it was actually kind of a relief for Jennifer when she found out Brryan was being deployed. We're in about late 1990 at this point, so the US was smack dab in the middle of the Gulf War. And I hate to say this, but frankly, for everyone involved, it probably would have been better if Brryan hadn't come back from Desert Storm. I know that sounds terrible, but give it time. You'll agree soon enough. Unfortunately, though, that was not the case, but he and Jennifer did make some plans in case things had ultimately shaken out that way. Mainly, they decided to bestow upon their unborn child his father's name, so Brryan Thomas Stewart Jr. Obviously, they did this as a way to solidify a connection between the two of them, a father-son connection, even if by some chance Brryan didn't make it home from the war. And when I tell you guys that that fact in particular is just painfully ironic, you'll see. All in all, Brryan served in the Persian Gulf for just under 3 months before he came home to his girlfriend and his brand new bouncing baby boy. Brryan Thomas Stewart Jackson was born on February 24th, 1991 in Clayton, Missouri, and to my knowledge, he was born completely healthy. He did go on to struggle with asthma fairly early on, but otherwise, he was born with no significant health issues. Jennifer went through labor, she gave birth, and she brought the baby home and cared for him by herself for the first few weeks before the war ended and the troops, including Brryan, were finally able to return home. And on the day that Brryan returned home from the Middle East, Jennifer met him at the airport with their new baby in tow, ready and eager to greet him and hoping to start their new family on a more positive foot. And honestly, at first, it seemed like things might actually go that way. When Brryan reunited with his family and met his new son for the first time, he broke down into tears right there in the middle of the airport. This little boy who shared his name not only looked just like him, but he was so sweet and so peaceful and just such a joy to come home to after 12 long, hard weeks away. But unfortunately, as the novelty wore off and Brryan and Jennifer got back to their regular lives, things again started to unravel pretty quickly. Brryan's mood swings returned, his abuse of Jennifer resumed, and after a while, he even started accusing Jennifer of cheating on him and insisting that there was simply no way that Brryan Jr. was his baby. Even when a paternity test proved that Brryan Jr. was in fact Brryan's child, he still refused to believe it. I don't know if it had to do with what he'd been through when he was overseas or just who he was as a person, but it was like he was becoming more and more deranged and more detached from reality with each passing day. He began to threaten not only to kill himself, but he also threatened to harm Jennifer as well as to harm baby Brryan. After he was discharged from the Navy, Brryan secured a job as a laboratory aide at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, and he actually used this position to frequently threaten and to scare Jennifer. He told her on numerous occasions that with the things he had access to at work, he could easily ruin someone's life or even kill them, and that no one would ever be able to connect the dots back to him. And this was especially concerning to Jennifer, considering the fact that Brryan frequently brought home blood samples from work and kept them in his family's freezer. Yeah, that's not fucking creepy or weird at all. Rightfully so, Jennifer was really starting to reach the end of her rope. She was used to putting up with Brryan and his bullshit at this point, but when he started threatening to harm the baby, that pushed her over the edge. Honestly, the only reason she'd stayed with him up to this point was because her mom made her feel like she needed to, constantly telling her that regardless of how terrible Brryan was, she just needed to stick it out with him because she already had one broken family between she, her daughter, and her daughter's father, so my God, she wouldn't want a second one. And to that I say, what kind of advice is that? Yes, my sweet daughter, please stay with this abusive man because it might tarnish our reputation if you have two broken families. Poor Jennifer was becoming such a nervous wreck that by the time August of 91 rolled around, she had to check herself into the stress ward at St. Joseph Health Center because she literally could not take it anymore. Ultimately, while she was inpatient, she and Brryan's relationship dissolved into nothing. However, this did nothing to ease the tension and the strain between the two of them. Quite the opposite, actually. Things between them somehow actually managed to get even worse following the dissolution of the romantic part of their relationship. Mainly this had to do with the fact that Jennifer, if nothing else, expected Brryan to at least honor the financial responsibility that he had to his child. An expectation that Brryan had absolutely no interest in fulfilling. He told Jennifer that he had no intentions of leaving any loose ends between the two of them. And although he was only required to pay, I think, less than $300 a month, he refused. He continued to assert that Brryan wasn't even his child, so why would he pay for him? And when that didn't work, he told Jennifer that it was in her best interest to leave him alone or that he would destroy her life. A threat that he promised he had the ability to carry out. Like, this man so badly wanted to be powerful and he wanted people to fear him. I think this is why he was so open with these threats and so open with telling people how easily he could smuggle harmful samples out of work. Sometimes he even lied about being a Secret Service agent. He would disappear some weekends and claim that he was out on secret missions. He was just so desperate to be important, and he just wasn't. And now that Jennifer was no longer under his thumb or under the same roof as him, she wasn't scared of him anymore. So she wasn't backing down this time. Unfortunately, though, neither was Brryan. And during one particularly heated argument, again, regarding child support, Brryan even went so far as to tell Jennifer that it wasn't necessary for her to fight for child support because, and I quote, "the child was not going to live long anyway." What? Yeah. 10 toes down with zero hesitation, Brryan stood in front of the mother of his son, and he told her that she didn't need to worry about child support because her son was not going to live past, 5. Now, of course, this took Jennifer back a bit, because what in the Miss Cleo was this Looney Tune talking about? How on earth could he, one, say that about his own son, but two, how could he possibly know that? And Jennifer asked him these questions, but all he told her was just not to worry about it. And then that was that, I guess. And then after that fight, Jennifer didn't hear from Brryan for a month. Honestly, probably a welcomed reprieve. Following that last blowout fight, Jennifer wouldn't see Brryan again until February of 1992. Remember I mentioned that baby Brryan would battle some pretty severe asthma before he even turned 1? This is that. He was admitted to the hospital on February 2nd, 1992, after Jennifer had rushed him in during what would turn out to be a severe asthma attack. Brryan had been wheezing and coughing. He was clearly having some serious trouble breathing, and after being examined and admitted to the hospital, he would actually spend the next 4 days there as he gradually recovered. And throughout this time, Jennifer did reach out to Brryan to let him know what was going on, because despite how rocky things had become between the two of them, she figured that if the tables were turned, she would absolutely want him to extend the same courtesy to her. Now, I certainly don't think she planned to receive any support from him during this time. He was pretty unreliable as a co-parent, if you could even call him that. So fancy her surprise when on February 6th, just hours before baby Brryan was set to be discharged, Brryan Sr. came waltzing into the hospital room like he was just freaking father of the year. He was dressed impeccably, as per usual, khakis, dress shirt, he was clean shaven. It was actually kind of an ongoing joke between he and the people that he worked with that he dressed way nicer than any of the rest of them did. And he presented to the hospital that day no differently. The only thing that struck Jennifer as odd, aside from the fact that he was there, was the fact that for some reason he was still carrying his lab coat with him, even though he would have absolutely no reason to need it while he was simply visiting his son. And she asked him why he brought it with him, and he just simply told her that he didn't want to leave it in the car, and then he changed the subject. They spoke briefly about baby Brryan and everything that had gone on over the preceding days before Jennifer then in passing just mentioned she was thirsty. Because this poor woman, she's been alone at the hospital with her sick son for 96 hours. She had probably barely even eaten anything, let alone kept herself hydrated. So when Brryan urged her to take a break and walk around, stretch her legs, and go get a drink from the cafeteria, she happily obliged. At this point, baby Brryan was doing great. He was set to go home in just a few hours, so surely she could leave him with his father for a few minutes so that she could go and grab a soda, right? Well, unfortunately, this decision, it would haunt Jennifer for years to come. When questioned later, Jennifer would state that she was probably only out of baby Brryan's room for maybe 20 minutes before she returned to just madness and calamity. When she had left the room, Brryan was sleeping peacefully in his little hospital cot. He was totally content, not a care in the world. However, when she'd returned post-cafeteria, he was hysterical. He was screaming, he was crying, and try as she might, he was completely inconsolable. Obviously, Jennifer asked Brryan what the hell had happened to her son. Why was he so upset? But all he told her was that he simply woke up and started crying. He told her he'd tried to calm him down, but that he'd had no luck and that's what she'd walked in on. And when I say baby Brryan was freaking out, he was so upset and he was screaming so much that Jennifer thought that he was like physically hurt. She believed that the only explanation for how sad her poor little baby was that he was physically injured. But no matter how hard she tried to find something, she could not find anything on her son's body that would indicate why he was so distressed. Eventually, she gave up and she ended up hitting the call button and requesting assistance from a nurse. But after a quick exam and some quick vitals, baby Brryan's medical team couldn't even seem to figure out what the hell was going on. Given that he was there for an asthma attack, a respiratory therapist was then called to the room, but they had no answers. Like that, baby Brryan had spiked a fever just out of the blue, and absolutely no one could determine the cause or why he had suddenly taken this turn for the worst. Things actually ended up getting so bad that the hospital staff recommended that baby Brryan be transferred to a larger and more equipped hospital, because frankly, they were stumped. By the time Brryan's transfer to Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital was complete, he had exhausted himself from crying. He passed out, and then by the time he woke up, whatever had been bothering him seemed to have passed. Jennifer was able to take him home soon after that, and although they never got any real answers for Brryan's episode, nobody expected him to go home to live anything other than an ordinary, healthy life. But little did anyone know that that day in the hospital, something deadly and something completely irreversible had been set into motion. And what's really crazy is that no one would have any idea that anything was wrong, like even slightly, for years. 4 years, to be exact. From that point up until Brryan was 5, he was a completely normal, completely healthy seeming little boy. He was active, he was energetic, he was growing right on track. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary and nothing that would have led anyone to believe that anything could be wrong with this little boy. But shortly after Brryan's 5th birthday, it was like a switch flipped, and Brryan's health, it fell completely apart. From March to May of 1996, Brryan began sleeping like 18 to 20 hours a day. He began rapidly losing weight. He was regularly spiking incredibly high fevers that even Tylenol couldn't touch. He was soaking his bed sheets with sweat every time he slept. He was all of a sudden having trouble with his mobility. I mean, as I'm sure you can imagine, it was an incredibly scary and an incredibly confusing time for both Jennifer and for Brryan. She took him to every possible doctor she could think of, and each doctor ran a wide array of tests, and ultimately, each doctor was left more confused than the last. No one could figure it out. No one could determine why on earth this little boy that was the picture of health 60 days ago now appeared to be knocking on death's door. And when I tell you that these doctors ran the gambit as far as testing and trying to diagnose Brryan went, they ran the gambit. They tested him for the most average, run-of-the-mill infections and conditions, all the way to conditions and diseases that had never even been documented in the US prior to him. And of course, each and every time the results came in and they were negative. Doctors were stumped. Jennifer was stumped. This boy had seemingly been checked over a solid week for every imaginable ailment that could possibly explain his symptoms. And they came away with zilch. This case was literally keeping Brryan's doctors awake at night. It was giving them nightmares. And believe it or not, it was actually one of these nightmares that led one of Brryan's doctors to order one final test. A test they had skipped over previously because the idea that a 5-year-old could have contracted this specific disease, it was unfathomable. But they were quite literally grasping at any possible straw they could at this point. So right then, in the middle of the night following this nightmare, Brryan's doctor called the hospital. He spoke to the on-call medical team, and he instructed them to test this 5-year-old boy for HIV. And sure enough, on May 24th, 1996, 5-year-old Brryan Thomas Stewart Jackson was diagnosed with not just HIV, but given how far the disease had managed to progress, Brryan was diagnosed with, and I quote, full-blown AIDS. Nowadays, I think most people know the difference between HIV and AIDS on at least like a surface level. Certainly, I was one of those people prior to researching this case, because even when I researched the Janice Trahan case, I didn't really look super far into exactly what the diseases were on their own or what exactly differentiated them. I'm familiar now, though, and buckle up, baby, because you're about to be familiar too. According to the Mayo Clinic, human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, is a virus that attacks the body's immune system, thus making it harder for the body to fight off other infections, illnesses, or diseases. If left untreated, like in poor little Brryan's case, HIV can eventually progress to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, which is the most advanced stage of HIV. How long it takes HIV to become AIDS completely varies from person to person and is often highly dependent on a person's individualized treatment. So while some people will develop AIDS in 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, with proper treatment, some people's HIV may never become AIDS. Typically, a doctor will look at 2 separate factors when determining if someone has HIV versus AIDS. First factor being the patient's CD4 count, or T cell count. A person with a healthy immune system typically has anywhere from 500 to 1600 CD4 cells in each cubic millimeter of their blood. However, a person with AIDS clocks in with fewer than 200 CD4 cells in each cubic millimeter of their blood. And then the second factor is the frequency of specific AIDS-defining infections, otherwise known as opportunistic infections, which generally occur and are more serious in people who have a CD4 count below 200. All this to say that when Brryan received his diagnosis, his CD4 count was 0. He had not a T cell in his body to help protect him from infections, and he was already infected with 3 opportunistic infections, hence full-blown AIDS. Jennifer could not believe it. How the hell had this happened to her child? He was perfectly healthy 2 months ago, and now the doctors were telling her that there was no chance he was going to survive this. He was terribly, terribly ill. He even flatlined on 2 separate occasions while he was in the hospital following this diagnosis. And his doctors told Jennifer that if he managed to make it out of the hospital, she needed to go home and start getting arrangements together for her son's funeral, because they were sure that he wouldn't possibly make it more than maybe another 4 to 5 months. And so, armed with 23 oral medications and I believe 3 separate IV medications, Brryan was essentially sent home to die. Jennifer even set aside a little white suit that Brryan had once worn as a ring bearer in a wedding to be his funeral suit. Even with his crazy new strict regimen of antiviral meds, truly no one expected Brryan to live to see his 6th birthday. While we know way more about HIV and AIDS today in 2024 than we ever have before, you have to remember that this was the 90s. We were right on the heels of the AIDS epidemic of the 80s. In fact, by 1992, AIDS had become the leading cause of death for American men between the ages of 25 to 44. So how in the actual fuck was this little 5-year-old boy in the end stages of this disease supposed to pull through? It just didn't seem likely. Even with rigid medication regimens like Brryan's, this virus is smart. It quite literally figures out how to grow and how to mutate even in the presence of medications, especially the rudimentary medications that were available in the mid-90s. And this is why HIV and AIDS have stumped scientists and medical professionals for going on 50 years. They just cannot get ahead of it. A couple of months ago, I saw a video that Stephanie Harlow posted about the death of the 3 Kansas City Chiefs fans. And one of the men that she talked about in that video at the time that story took place had actually actively been working on an HIV and AIDS vaccine. And the way that she explained in that video the complexity of HIV, just props to her, because it truly made it so easy to understand and it was very digestible. So if you don't mind, I'm actually literally going to read off exactly what she said. HIV is different because of how quickly it mutates, which is why a vaccination has been so hard to create. It's like trying to knit a shirt for a baby, and when you see this baby, it's a certain size, so you start knitting the sweater for this baby, but by the time you have the sweater ready, the baby has aged 15 years, grown a tail, and maybe another arm out of its back, so the sweater obviously doesn't fit anymore. You have to go back to the drawing board and you have to make a new sweater. One that's bigger, one that has an armhole coming out of the back, and maybe even a little canopy for a tail. But then the same thing keeps happening. When you go back to the baby has 2 heads. Now you make a sweater that has 2 neck holes. Basically, you can't ever get this sweater right. And that's basically what it's like trying to treat and prevent HIV. By the time you've come up with a treatment or a preliminary vaccine, the disease has mutated so dramatically that you literally are catapulted right back to square one. Honestly, it's quite fascinating. I found myself completely enveloped in this research because it really is just wow. Speaking of, I know this is random and I know this doesn't really fit here, but I do know that Stephanie Harlow is going through an just unimaginably difficult time right now. So if you could either send some prayers her way or just some positive thoughts. I know that she will literally never see this, and that's not the point. My heart breaks for her and her family and what they're going through right now. So I would be remiss to mention her, but not to mention that. Anyway, after receiving Brryan's diagnosis, Jennifer sort of went through the same obsession. Obviously, her sudden interest was out of necessity, where I had the privilege of it simply being chosen research. But following Brryan's diagnosis, Jennifer began learning everything she could about HIV and AIDS and the different medications available and the different therapy options that were available. She read every newspaper article she could and every book she could find on HIV or AIDS. She spent hours in the hospital library reading medical journals. She dedicated herself to understanding what was going on with her son to the absolute best of her ability. And quite frankly, she likely saved his life by doing this research and by then advocating for different forms of treatment for Brryan that, prior to his case, had never been used to treat AIDS in children. Truly, Jennifer, she is a super mom. Mind you, though, that Jennifer was not the only person hard at work for baby Brryan. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, the effort to solve the mystery of how baby Brryan had contracted HIV gets kicked into high gear. Don't go nowhere. Hi, we're back. Just before our break, Jennifer had received Brryan's diagnosis and she jumped into action, as had multiple public health officials. When someone is diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, it kicks a process called contact tracing into effect. And essentially, contact tracing is the process of identifying people who have recently been in contact with someone diagnosed with an infectious disease. So when diagnosed in adults, it's typically, who have you had sex with recently? Are you a drug user? Who have you recently used drugs with? HIV is transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids, primarily either sexual fluids or via shared needles used for intravenous drug use. But Brryan was 5. He certainly wasn't out having sex or shooting up heroin, meaning that they had a serious problem on their hands. How had this 5-year-old boy contracted this virus? Contrary to ignorant beliefs of the time, you cannot contract HIV or AIDS from hugging, from kissing someone, or shaking hands with someone. HIV doesn't even survive long outside of the human body, so you can't get it from toilet seats, doorknobs, dishes. It's not spread through mosquito bites, tick bites, other insect bites. It's certainly not spread through air or through the water. It's not even spread through spit or tears, sweat or feces or urine that doesn't have blood mixed in with it. Basically, what I'm getting at is, given the fact that Brryan had not had HIV passed down to him from Jennifer at birth, because Jennifer does not have HIV, this meant that something incredibly alarming had to have happened to him in order for him to end up where he was. And with no way to figure this out for themselves, Brryan's medical team ultimately chose to reach out to police for further assistance. Over the following 2 years, police looked into every possible avenue that they could imagine to try to explain how Brryan had come to be HIV positive. They spent hours upon hours interviewing anyone and everyone that had ever been close to Jennifer and Brryan over the years preceding his diagnosis. So family members, friends, babysitters, doctors, all of these people were subject to not just police interviews, but they were all required to submit blood samples to determine their HIV status. 26 different individuals, I believe, was the exact number of people that were close to Brryan and Jennifer that police tested, and that all ultimately came back testing negative for HIV. Now, thankfully, over this 2-year period, doctors were able to get a substantial hold on Brryan's HIV, and actually by January 1997, so less than a year after Jennifer was told to take her son home to die, Brryan's viral load was actually so low that his HIV was literally undetectable. Obviously, this was miraculous and just a huge weight off of Jennifer, relatively speaking. Because sure, AIDS technically isn't reversible, but for the time being, she was able to put that little white funeral suit back away and actually hope for a future for her son. Still though, that did not answer the million-dollar question. She continued to agonize over how on earth they had even ended up in the position where she was told to plan a funeral for her 5-year-old. How had Brryan gotten sick? Pardon my French, but where the flying, foodling fuck had this little boy contracted HIV? And that is when all of a sudden, completely out of the blue, it hit her. 2 years after Brryan's initial diagnosis, the memory of his estranged father looking her square in the eyes and telling her that her little boy wasn't going to live past 5, it finally came back to her like a bag of bricks to the face. This man had threatened to kill her with a syringe on numerous occasions. And if anyone had access to HIV-infected blood, surely a phlebotomist would. In fact, she knew that he did, because if you'll cast your memory back, I mentioned earlier that Brryan's creepy Dexter Morgan wannabe butt chin having ass used to smuggle vials of blood out of the hospital and keep them at home in his freezer, like trophies. It all seemed so obvious now. How had she not thought of this before? How had it taken her this long to put the pieces together? Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we think it's obvious that Brryan was responsible, but at the time, she hadn't seen Brryan in years when she got her son's diagnosis. And given the time frame we're in, she was likely completely unaware of how easily HIV can go unnoticed in someone if you don't know that you need to be looking for it. And that's not even taking into consideration that at first, it all seems too evil and too deplorable to be true. This boy was purposefully injected with HIV by his own father. It sounds like something that could only happen in like a TV drama. However, once Jennifer brought her concerns to police, they actually didn't really think so. Not only did Brryan have the means, motive, and opportunity, but he had access to the blood, and in his own words, he didn't want to leave any loose ends from he and Jennifer's relationship. Couple that with the fact that it was at his urging that she had left him alone in their son's hospital room that day so that she could go grab herself a soda. Once they had discussed all of this and she had clued them into Brryan's complete 180 the day that his dad visited him in the hospital, well, It didn't take them long to theorize that perhaps baby Brryan had been so inconsolable when Jennifer had returned to his room that day because he was experiencing a hemolytic reaction. A hemolytic reaction, as I'm sure you've probably sort of pieced together at this point, is a serious complication that occurs typically during a blood transfusion when a patient's immune system attacks incompatible transfused red blood cells. Remember in the Janice Trahan case when she said she got her B12 shot and she was immediately in excruciating pain? Yeah, that's because your body does not like coming into contact with blood that isn't at least its own type. Your immune system can pretty much instantly differentiate your own blood cells from someone else's. So if you receive blood that's even partially incompatible with your own, your body will immediately begin to produce antibodies to destroy those foreign cells. Typical symptoms of a hemolytic reaction include fevers, chills, nausea, chest and lower back pain, dark or bloody urine, fainting, dizziness, or like a flushing of the skin. These symptoms typically appear right after a blood transfusion, but in rare instances, they can sometimes develop like several days later. And honestly, in such a little baby, it is shocking that Brryan was able to bounce back as quickly as he did. Severe complications of having incompatible blood injected into your system can go so far as to include kidney failure, anemia, respiratory issues, shock. I mean, there is a reason that blood donation is a thing and that blood centers will hound you if you have certain like in-demand types of blood. They can't just go around slinging any old type of blood into any old body. It will, in fact, fuck you right up. Like I said, I went way deeper into the medical side of things this time around than I did when it came to Janice Trahan's case, which, by the way, begs this question. How are there two of these horrible men on this planet? Y'all were shocked to hear Janice Trahan's case, so I can't wait to hear y'all's reaction to this one. It is certainly a doozy. Once police began looking seriously into Brryan Sr. as a suspect, they began like a covert surveillance on him just to kind of get a feel for him and for his routine, as well as to try to assess if he might pose a possible risk to anyone else. Luckily, it was determined that despite his apparent fairly decent criminal record, a record which included but was not limited to assault, theft, and spousal abuse, police did not believe that at the time of their investigation, he actually was immediately dangerous to anyone else. So this gave them plenty of time to put together a pretty strong case before they pulled the trigger on arresting him. At the time of his arrest, Brryan was working as a lab assistant at St. Louis University Medical Center, and actually it was in the parking lot of his work that he was first approached by police. Brryan was initially brought into the station under the guise of an interview on Wednesday, April 22nd, 1998. However, after refusing to answer any questions or even to speak through 8 straight hours of questioning, ultimately Brryan Thomas Stewart Sr. was arrested, and he was charged with first-degree assault for allegedly infecting his own infant son with HIV-infected blood. And when word of his arrest, and especially of what his charges were, got back to the people over at St. Louis UMC, Brryan was immediately placed on administrative leave, pending the result of his trial. Overall, Brryan was facing anywhere from 10 years to life in prison, and although his son had lived significantly longer already than doctors initially believed he would, there was still a chance that he would not have the opportunity for a full life. And this was actually incredibly important to consider because it left the door open for the charge possibly being amended to murder later on if Brryan Jr. were to have died. Had that happened, this would have made Brryan Sr. eligible for the death penalty. Ironically, he would have been looking at lethal injection in that event, which was basically exactly what he'd believed he'd administered to his own son all those years ago. Reprehensibly, there were people who thought that the state should forego the assault charges and only pursue a case against Brryan Sr. if and when Brryan Jr. did die. And while I don't think that I need to explain to you how completely fucking ridiculous that whole notion is, the prosecution did argue that immediate justice was necessary because if they didn't immediately go after him, Brryan could flee, the evidence could get stale. Christ, Brryan could have walked out of the court and gotten hit by a bus. And then what? Just Brryan Jr. never gets any justice? Personally, I think old boy should have been charged with attempted murder, just like Dr. Dick was in Janice Trahan's case, but I guess that's just me. Either way, though, Brryan was arrested. He pled not guilty to his charges, and he was held on a $500,000 bail in St. Charles County Jail, located in St. Charles, Missouri. Brryan's trial began in late November 1998, with the prosecution arguing that Brryan had undoubtedly injected he and Jennifer's son with HIV-infected blood in an effort to kill him to prevent paying child support. And as if that argument wasn't made obvious enough by the numerous times that Brryan was said to have moved and gone by aliases, even fabricated social security numbers in an effort to avoid being located for child support, the prosecution also had an absolute lineup of witnesses ready to testify to what a piece of shit Brryan truly was. Sadly, by the time the trial had rolled around, Brryan Jr.'s health had once again taken a turn for the worst. He was again battling fevers, he was suffering from a swollen liver, he had chronic ear infections, and he was suffering from fungal growth under his fingernails. Truly, this little boy was going through it, all while this awful man had the audacity to sit in this courtroom and try to pretend that he wasn't responsible. Thankfully, though, Jennifer was present. She was there the whole trial, and she was ready to fight for justice for her little boy. During just her first day of testimony, Jennifer was questioned for over 5 hours. She testified to the tumultuous nature of she and Brryan's relationship. She testified about how awful and hostile he'd made their breakup. She testified about the numerous threats he made to her, down to even threatening to kill her and needing only a syringe to do so. And of course, she testified to her recollection of all that had transpired at the hospital back in February of 1992. Testimony that the prosecution then used to introduce and educate the idea of a hemolytic reaction to the jurors. Following Jennifer's testimony, 2 other former partners of Brryan's also took the stand to testify to some not so flattering things about Brryan. First, a former girlfriend of his named April testified that Brryan had told her that his son had been diagnosed with AIDS over 4th of July weekend, 1996. And that is especially interesting when you learn that no one could find Brryan to reach out to him regarding his son's diagnosis until 2 weeks later. The other woman was a woman named Elizabeth, whom Brryan was actually briefly married to in the years after he and Jennifer had split. She testified that not only had Brryan been physically abusive to her during the course of their relationship, but also that prior to obtaining an order of protection against Brryan in November of 95, allegedly Brryan had told her, quote, "If you screw with me, you'll be sorry. I'll be your worst nightmare. You will regret you ever saw my face." And while that is obviously awful to say to someone, I think, to Brryan's credit, we probably all do wish at this point that we'd never seen this square-headed Nimrod's stupid idiot face.
Got him!
And as if the women's testimonies didn't make Brryan look bad enough, the prosecution also called Stephen Zagar to the stand. Stephen was a former military friend of Brryan's who testified to hearing Brryan state on at least one occasion that if someone ever messed with him, given his phlebotomy training, he could easily inject them with something and that they would never know what hit them. He claimed that apparently he had ways of doing away with people that no one would ever even notice. Even if you think these things to yourself, why on earth would you ever speak that shit out loud to a third party? Idiot. In response to the prosecution's argument, the defense argued that there was just simply no way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that things went down the way that Jennifer and the prosecution believed they did. Instead, they asserted that the symptoms baby Brryan had experienced, that the prosecution then had concluded was a hemolytic reaction, could have actually easily been caused by a multitude of other health issues. We know baby Brryan had severe asthma, therefore he'd been subject to quite a few different medical procedures in his short life prior to being diagnosed with HIV. Therefore, the defense believed that it was much more likely that he'd contracted HIV during a not-so-sterile medical procedure rather than via a direct injection. The problem with that theory, though, was that baby Brryan had never undergone a blood transfusion, which at the time was the most likely avenue that a person could contract HIV outside of sexual contact or intravenous drug use. And while we obviously know that 11-month-old Brryan wasn't an intravenous drug user, unfortunately, the same could not be said for a select few members of his close family. Jennifer's sister Veronica and her boyfriend Lee did live with Jennifer and Brryan Jr. for less than a month back in the fall of 1993. And while we know that Brryan was already infected with HIV prior to his aunt and her boyfriend ever even moving in with he and Jennifer in the first place, the defense argued that because Veronica and Lee were frequent IV drug users, perhaps they had left paraphernalia of some sort lying around at some point, and that maybe baby Brryan had found it and pricked himself with it. Maybe that was how he had contracted HIV. And while that sounds like a compelling argument at first, definitely enough to introduce at least some reasonable doubt, it becomes a lot less compelling the more layers you peel back. For starters, the chances of a person contracting HIV from a shallow needle prick, less than 1%. And while, sure, 1% isn't nothing, Veronica and Lee swore that they had never left any of their equipment. They claimed they were very careful about never leaving drugs or needles anywhere that Brryan could get a hold of them. Even when Jennifer found a needle of her sister's, which actually ended up being the catalyst for kicking her and Lee out, but even that needle was up on a high shelf that Brryan never could have reached on his own. And if that doesn't convince you that Veronica and Lee are not to blame for Brryan's HIV, perhaps this next point will. Neither Veronica nor Lee had HIV. If you'll remember, during the initial investigation into how Brryan had contracted HIV in the first place, police had ordered upwards of 30 people whom he and Jennifer were close with, all to submit to HIV testing. And Veronica and Lee were both in that order. They had both given blood samples and they had both tested negative. So ultimately, the defense was forced into attempting one last ridiculous Hail Mary of an argument. As a last-ditch effort, Brryan Sr.'s defense argued that had it not been a medical procedure, nor a needle prick from a drug-using family member, nor sexual abuse, which the investigation had also ruled out, they still couldn't believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Brryan Sr. was responsible, because there was still a possibility that the virus could have been passed to baby Brryan in, and I quote, a way that had not been discovered yet. Yeah, the money that guy spent on his law degree, money well spent. Oh, I know my client looks guilty, but he also might not be guilty because of something we haven't discovered yet. What fucking legal sitcom did this guy pull that argument from? Like, he truly could not have expected that to be the idea that clinched his client's not guilty verdict. I mean, come on. At no point throughout the trial did Brryan Sr. elect to take the stand. Actually, I don't think that he's ever really, beyond pleading not guilty, spoken out in his own defense. The only real statement I've ever come across that he's given regarding the matter was years after his trial when he was asked to do a couple of interviews. He never really spoke on the case much, per se, but he was definitely devoted to using his words to virtue signal, stating that he was a good person with a good heart that never could have done what he was being accused of. He claimed that he loved his son unconditionally, that as a baby he hugged him and burped him and squeezed him, changed his diapers, bathed him, and rocked him to sleep. In fact, he actually had the audacity to argue that Brryan Jr. wouldn't have been born at all had it not been for him, because Jennifer had wanted to have an abortion. Obviously, this is just bullshit that he's spouting in an effort to change the public's incredibly low opinion of him, as is his stance that Brryan's HIV test was falsely positive. Yes, he claims that Brryan does not and never had HIV, and that rather than setting the record straight, he's now bragging and exploiting HIV on his Facebook. As if I could not hate this man more, he pops off with that shit. It's not enough that he tried to kill his son by altering his life completely, but now he wants to try to paint him out to be some opportunistic villain exploiting and essentially mocking HIV as a whole. Like, this man is deplorable. Once the trial had concluded and all testimonies had been made and arguments presented, jurors deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning with their verdict. Late in the evening on Saturday, December 5th, 1998, a jury composed of 6 men and 6 women unanimously found 32-year-old Brryan Stewart Sr. guilty as charged of first-degree assault. His sentencing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, December 8th, where for the first time since the injection, Brryan Sr. was confronted by his son. Although Brryan Jr. was still too ill to physically be present in court, Jennifer did read a statement aloud for the court that Brryan had written specifically for this exact moment. In part, the letter read, quote, "I think he shouldn't ever be out of jail. He shouldn't have done this. Why did he do such a bad thing to me? I'm very mad at him. Why can't he say sorry?" Heartbreaking, right? Then though, on the opposite end of the spectrum, following Brryan Jr.'s statement, the presiding judge, Ellsworth Cundiff, he proceeded to read Brryan Sr.'s ass straight to filth. In a statement that one paper referred to as a verbal pounding, which I love, Judge Cundiff stated, quote, "I can't imagine anything worse. You've reached new heights. You're in a class by yourself. I believe that when God finally calls you, you are going to burn in hell from here to eternity. And maybe that is the only justice that will come of this, is when you are finally gone. My thought is that injecting a 10-month-old child with the AIDS virus really puts you in the same category as a war criminal, as the worst war criminal. The maximum I can do with you is life in prison, and I don't really think that's a very fair sentence, not with all that your son is going to have to go through. And with that, Judge Cundiff did proceed to sentence Brryan to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Brryan did go on to try to appeal his conviction sometime in 2000. However, his arguments were garbage and his conviction and sentence were upheld. He was first eligible for parole in 2011. However, he's been denied parole twice since then. He's currently serving his time in protective custody at Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center. He spends every single day by himself due to extreme hostility from the other inmates, because they all know exactly what he did and why he's there. He has no friends, no acquaintances. He spends every day alone writing letters to people who probably don't really even want to hear from him in the first place. And while I 1,000,000% know that solitary confinement is basically torture, I am completely incapable of feeling even a shred of sympathy for this vile man, given what he did to find himself there, given the absolute hell on earth he has willingly put his own son through. Just because he was convicted and got life in prison, it didn't magically fix or erase the hardships his son was left to live with, thanks to him. Yeah, he might have managed to outlive his initial prognosis, but his childhood was far from easy, and it certainly wasn't normal. For years, Brryan was on some 20+ medications. He had to have a G-tube in order to stay properly nourished. He ended up with speech difficulties due to nerve damage done to his ears from one of his many medications. Like, this little boy was put through the absolute ringer, and that was all before he even started school. Thankfully, doctors were able to get Brryan's health managed well enough that he was able to attend a traditional school. However, like most things in his life, this too proved to be much more difficult for Brryan than it was for his peers. Everyone knew of him and what had happened to him. Everyone knew his diagnosis. And it's the early 2000s at this point, so people are still wildly ignorant to HIV and AIDS. People are still ignorant to it today, so back then, fucking forget it. Brryan was routinely teased and mocked and ostracized by his peers. They called him AIDS boy and they called him gay, even though, one, you don't have to be gay to have AIDS, and two, Brryan had not contracted HIV through sex to begin with. They didn't care. He was routinely pushed or hit. He was constantly getting into fights. Like, it sounds awful. And honestly, the adults weren't much better. For starters, where do you think that kids learn to say all of this degrading shit that they were saying to him? And then putting that aside, Brryan was barred from playing football, from being on the wrestling team. Christ, they wouldn't even let the poor kid be a Boy Scout out of fear that somehow he would give the other kids AIDS. Truly just beyond ridiculous. Obviously, I'm saying this now with hindsight and living in a world that at least has more of an understanding of HIV and AIDS, but still, to treat an innocent child like this, or to allow him to be treated like this, all over something that he had absolutely no control over and no fault in, it tears my heart into pieces to think about what this kid had to go through. And honestly, it wasn't even just Brryan that suffered. Jennifer went on to have a few more kids after she had Brryan, and even they were ostracized and made fun of because of Brryan's diagnosis. Parents either told their children not to hang out with Brryan and his siblings, or kids simply wouldn't befriend him or his siblings because they knew of his diagnosis. And it wasn't even like things at school were bad, but then home life was perfect, because things were just as difficult for them at home for a plethora of other reasons. Obviously, there was the uncertainty of their brother's health, never knowing if, when he went to the hospital, was it going to be the last time they ever saw him? He was constantly sick, so they weren't able to interact with him in the same way that they could interact with each other a lot of the time. Just the ripple effect that this had on every facet of Brryan's life, as well as every facet of his family's life. It is just insane how deeply what his father had done to him was truly able to penetrate. Jennifer did win a settlement from a lawsuit that she filed against Brryan Sr.'s old employer. However, the family still really struggled financially throughout Brryan's childhood. Jennifer actually had to quit her job, not just to make sure that she was always available for Brryan, but she also had to make sure that she could qualify for the financial aid needed to cover Brryan's medical expenses. Jennifer had to keep her family's income below a certain point, which sure benefited Brryan medically, but it made Jennifer feel incredibly guilty because she felt like she was holding her other children back. And well, as a mother, I can feel that to my bones. There is no greater pain as a parent than not being able to give your child anything they could possibly want. But what else was she supposed to do? Was she supposed to forego Brryan's medical care? Obviously, that wasn't an option, so talk about being between a rock and a fucking hard place. And what's even more devastating, if you can believe that, is that as Brryan got older and more perceptive, as kids do, he started to pick up on how difficult his diagnosis seemed to be making things for his family. He took that, he internalized all of the crap that he knew his family was going through, and he truly felt as though it was his fault. He started to wholeheartedly believe that things would be much better for everyone if he just wasn't there anymore. And so, when Brryan was just 13 years old, he decided that was it. He was done. He was going to take his own life. He grabbed 3 different knives from his family's kitchen and he headed into his bedroom. He sat there alone and depleted, staring at these knives, ready to end it all, when out of the corner of his eye, he saw his Bible. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming pull to the book. And so he grabbed it, he opened it completely randomly, and he read Psalm 42. In particular, the line that saved Brryan's life that day read, quote, "Why are you so downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God." According to Google, not religious, sorry. But according to Google, this full passage is about the struggles that life may bring, and it's about reminding the reader that although times may get tough, you can always find hope in God. And like I said, this completely flipped Brryan's perspective on life, on his illness. It changed his outlook on quite literally everything about everything. Following this near brush with death, Brryan realized that he had a purpose. He had a story to tell, and a story that he knew he could inspire people with. He could change people's lives with. And from that point on, Brryan has continued to do just that. He has shared his story to high schools, to colleges. He has spoken at juvenile centers. He's spoken to a multitude of different youth organizations. He's spoken at congressional briefings in DC, and he's told his story on numerous different television programs. He's not only traveled the country spreading his message of hope and positivity, but he's also traveled to other countries like Haiti, Ecuador, England, Kenya, Canada, to name a few. He's worked as a camp counselor at Camp Kindle, which is a residential camp for HIV-positive youths. I mean, truly, he has done incredible work in taking what happened to him and using it to inspire so many other people and so many other children who have also been living with HIV. He even started his own HIV organization called Hope is Vital, with the primary goal of supporting those living with HIV and educating everyone else. HIV is not a death sentence anymore. We covered this in my Janice Trahan video as well. With the medical knowledge and advancements that we have nowadays, a person with HIV can live a long and healthy life with the help of the right medications and therapies to manage their condition. And as far as I can tell, Brryan appears to be doing just that. He's engaged to be married, he's active on social media, and above all, he dreams of someday becoming a father himself. He has spent years helping his mother raise his siblings, and he wants so badly to have his own children that he can raise in hope. He wants to raise his children to believe that the world is a peaceful place and that he will always be there to protect them, and that even through bad times, great things are possible. As for his relationship with his own father, understandably so, he doesn't really have one. When he was 8, he opted to change the spelling of his name from Brryan to Brryan, on top of then also adopting just his mother's surname rather than the hyphenated version he was given at birth. And obviously all of this has been done in an effort to distance himself from his bad. He has had the misfortune of seeing him, I believe, once since all of this happened. He gave a statement at one of Brryan Sr.'s parole hearings a while back. And actually, he said that he thinks so few and far between about his father that had he not seen a recent mugshot of him, he doesn't even think he would have been able to recognize him. He says that while he doesn't want him released from prison, he really holds no ill will towards him. Honestly, he said he doesn't really feel anything about him or towards him. Sure, he hopes that somewhere deep down in the swirling black vortex where his father's heart is supposed to be, that maybe he could feel some regret or some remorse for what he did to him, but overall, it really doesn't affect him one way or another anymore. He believes that his father is paying his consequences and that outside of that, he forgives him. He doesn't want to hold a grudge against him because he knows he's better than that. He just doesn't need to burden himself by sinking to his father's level. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the information and the links for the products I use today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be here somewhere on the screen for you. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then, though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye. How asymmetrical is my face? Should I be studied? What's going on? Impeccably, and rigid medication. She read every newspaper and quite frankly, and ultimately all of that tested, incompatible These symptoms typically appear right after a blood transfusion. It actually left the door open for the charge to injected he and Jennifer's son with HIV and idea of a this medical talk, man, on the idea of the jury on the idea of I'm gonna cry. educate the idea of I'll never get it out of my mouth. The idea of a hemolytic this is outrageous. She tested about. Am I all right? Good God. Did HIV in the first place. Damn it. As. Once the trial hit. Brryan would go on to try to. Am I all right today? What in the fuck is going on? It changed everything. Everything about. He's spoken at